The 7 Years' War was a conflict that took place from 1756 to 1763 and involved all the major powers of Europe. The battles were fought all around the world, most notably in Europe, North America, the Caribbean, and India. A major part of this global conflict was colonial and imperial friction between Britain and France. In August 1758, Britain sent an expeditionary force to the European continent as a part of an Anglo-Hanoverian Prussian army to defend the electorate of Hanover against France. British King George II was the Prince-Elector of Hanover, and France had sought to conquer the territory since the spring of 1757. The Battle of Minden in present-day Germany was the decisive action that decided the fate of Hanover between the two great powers and was fought on Wednesday, August 1st, 1759. The Allied commander, Prussian General Prince Ferdinand of Brunswick, had 42,000 men against the 53,000 of the French Marshal Louis-Georges Erasme de Contades. The battle was notable for three main things: the perfect steadiness of the British infantry as they marched through a withering crossfire, their defeat first of the French cavalry and then of infantry attacks, and the inexplicable refusal of Lord George Sackville to obey a 4 times repeated order to charge with his cavalry. The men who fought at Minden were made famous in a poem written by the Victorian author Rudyard Kipling in 1895. A letter written by Lieutenant Hugh Montgomery of the 12th Regiment of Foot to his mother describes his account of the battle and the aftermath.
Dear Madam, the pursuit of the enemy, who have retired with the greatest precipitation, prevents me from giving you so exact an account of the late most glorious victory over the French army, as I would, had I almost any leisure. However, here goes as much as I can. We marched from camp between 4 and 5 o'clock in the morning. About 7 drew up in a valley. From thence marched about 300 yards, when an 18-pound ball came gently rolling up to us. Now began the most disagreeable march that I ever had in my life, for we advanced more than a quarter of a mile through a most furious fire from a most infernal battery of 18-pounders, which was at first upon our front, but as we proceeded, bore upon our flank, and at last upon our rear. It might be imagined that this cannonade would render the regiments incapable of bearing the shock of unhurt troops drawn up long before on ground of their own choosing, but firmness and resolution will surmount almost any difficulty. When we got within about 100 yards of the enemy, a large body of French cavalry galloped boldly down upon us. These our men, by reserving their fire until they came within 30 yards, immediately ruined, but not without receiving some injury from them, for they rode down 2 companies on the right of our regiment, wounded 3 officers, took one of them prisoner with our artillery lieutenant, and whipped off the tumbrils. This cost them dear, for it forced many of them into our rear, on whom the men faced about, and 5 of them did not return. These visitants being thus dismissed, without giving us a moment's time to recover the unavoidable disorder, down came upon us like lightning the glory of France in the persons of the gendarmes. These we almost immediately dispersed, without receiving hardly any mischief from the harmless creatures. We now discovered a large body of infantry, consisting of 17 regiments moving down directly on our flank in column, a very ugly situation. But Stuart's regiment and ours wheeled and showed them a front, which is a thing not to be expected from troops already twice attacked, but this must be placed to the credit of General Waldegrave and his aide-de-camp. We engaged this corps for about 10 minutes, killed them a good many, and as the song says, the rest then ran away. The next who made their appearance were some regiments of the Grenadiers of France, as fine and terrible-looking fellows as I ever saw. They stood us a tug. Notwithstanding, we beat them off to a distance, where they galled us much, they having rifled barrels, and our muskets would not reach them. To remedy this, we advanced. They took the hint and ran away. Now we were in hopes that we had done enough for one day's work, and that they would not disturb us more. But soon after, a very large body of fresh infantry, the last resource of Contades, made the final attempt on us. With them, we had a long but not very brisk engagement. At last, made them retire almost out of reach, when the 3 English regiments of the rear line came up and gave them one fire which sent them off for good and all. But what is wonderful to tell, we ourselves, after all this success at the very same time, also retired. But indeed, we did not then know that victory was ours. However, we rallied, but all that could now be mustered was about 13 files private with our colonel and 4 other officers, one of which I was so fortunate to be. With this remnant, we returned again to the charge, but to our unspeakable joy no opponents could be found. It is astonishing that this victory was gained by 6 English regiments of foot, without their grenadiers, unsupported by cavalry or cannon, not even their own battalion guns, in the face of a dreadful battery so near as to tear them with grape shot, against 40 battalions and 36 squadrons, which is directly the quantity of the enemy which fell to their share. It is true that 2 Hanoverian regiments were engaged on the left of the English, but so inconsiderably as to lose only 50 men between them. On the left of the army, the Grenadiers, who now form a separate body, withstood a furious cannonade. Of the English, there was only killed 1 captain and 1 sergeant. Some Prussian dragoons were engaged and did good service. Our artillery, which was stationed in different places, also behaved well, but the grand attack on which depended the fate of the day fell to the lot of the 6 English regiments of foot. From this account, the prince might be accused of misconduct for trusting the issue of so great an event to so small a body. But this affair you will have soon enough explained to the disadvantage of a great man whose easy part, had it been properly acted, must have occasioned to France one of the greatest overthrows it ever met with. The sufferings of our regiment will give you the best notion of the smartness of the action. We actually fought that day not more than 480 privates and 27 officers. Of the first 302 were killed and wounded, and of the latter, 18. 3 lieutenants were killed on the spot. The rest are only wounded, and all of them are in a good way except 2. Of the officers who escaped, there are only 4 who cannot show some marks of the enemy's good intentions, and as perhaps you may be desirous to know any little risks that I might have run, I will mention those of which I was sensible. At the beginning of the action, I was almost knocked off my legs by my 3 right-hand men, who were killed and drove against me by a cannonball. The same ball also killed 2 men close to Ward, whose post was in the rear of my platoon, and in this place I will assure you that he behaved with the greatest bravery, which I suppose you will make known to his father and friends. Some time after I received from a spent ball just such a rap on my collarbone as I have frequently from that once most dreadful weapon, your crooked-headed stick. It just swelled and grew red enough to convince the neighbours that I was not fibbing when I mentioned it. I got another of these also on one of my legs, which gave me about as much pain as would a tap of Miss Matthews's fan. The last and greatest misfortune of all fell to the share of my poor old coat, for a musket ball entered into the right skirt of it and made 3 holes. I had almost forgot to tell you that my spontoon was shot through a little below my hand. This disabled it, but a French one now does duty in its room. The consequences of this affair are very great. We found by the papers that the world began to give us up, and the French had swallowed us up in their imaginations. We have now pursued them above 100 miles with the advanced armies of the hereditary Prince, Wangenheim, and Urf in our front, of whose success in taking prisoners and baggage and receiving deserters, France's joy will give you a better account than I can at present. They are now entrenching themselves at Cassel, and you may depend on it, they will not show us their faces again during this campaign. I have the pleasure of being able to tell you that Captain Rainey is well. He is at present in advance with the Grenadiers, plundering French baggage and taking prisoners. I would venture to give him 40 ducats for his share of prize money. I have now, contrary to my expectations, and in spite of many interruptions, wrote you a long letter. This paper I have carried this week past in my pocket for the purpose, but could not attempt it before. We marched into this camp yesterday evening, and shall quit it early in the morning. I wrote you a note just informing you that I was well the day after the battle. I hope you will receive it in due time. Be pleased to give my most affectionate duty to my uncles and aunts, and believe me to be, with the greatest affection, your very dutiful son, Hugh Montgomery. Camp at Paddington, 9th of August, 1759. The noise of the battle frightened our sutler's wife into labor the next morning. She was brought to bed of a son, and we had him christened by the name of Ferdinand.
Although the French had some success in the first few years of the war, they began to suffer serious defeats in 1759 and onward, leading to the Treaty of Paris in 1763. In the terms of the treaty, France gave up all its territories in mainland North America, effectively ending any foreign military threat to the British colonies there. Even though the Treaty of Paris seemed to make the British Empire stronger than ever, it ultimately set its Anglo-American colonists on the path towards seeking independence. Major differences between the imperial government and colonists, such as how to levy taxes to pay for debts on wartime expenses, would lead to war just over a decade later. Many veterans of Minden played prominent roles in the war for American independence. One of them was Lord George Sackville, who was responsible for the general conduct of the war against the American colonists. The French Revolution began in 1789 and was a watershed event in modern European history. Regular French citizens sought to remake their country's political landscape, uprooting centuries-old institutions such as absolute monarchy and the feudal system. Other nations soon became involved in the struggle when French revolutionaries sought to expand the boundaries of the country. The coming War of the First Coalition marked the beginning of a long-lasting conflict between the French and the British. On top of this, competing political factions in France soon changed the nature of the revolution. After the fall of the Girondins and the rise of the Jacobins at the National Convention, several parts of France turned against the revolution in June 1793. Important cities in the south, such as Marseille and Nîmes, followed the path of insurrection. The convention reacted by sending the Army of the Alps, led by General Carteau. This force recaptured Avignon in July 1793 and Marseille a few weeks later on August 25th. Stories of the bloody reprisals following the capture of Marseille encouraged the Royalists to surrender the city of Toulon to Admiral Hood, the commander of an Anglo-Spanish squadron. Apart from the failed siege of Dunkirk, this was the first important contribution made by Great Britain to the War of the First Coalition. Eager to punish the city of Toulon for what they perceived as an incredible act of treason, Republican forces began the siege on September 8, 1793. A lieutenant named François-Michel Royer had fought for the Republic since 1792. In a letter to his parents, he described the capture of Marseille, the role played by the British, and the early phase of the siege.
The Camp of Toulon, Army of Carteau, 17 September 1793, Year 1 of the French Republic. Dear Father and Mother, I have not received an answer to the letter that I have written to you, and the difficult circumstances in which we were forbade me from writing again. However, you must have received my letter from Arles. You could not believe how badly we have suffered. Never sleep in a bed, ways exposed to the weather, no tent, and more often than not, no supplies. It is happy for us that it is not raining, and since I left you, we have seen no rain. The sea breeze is also against us. Well, this is nothing as long as the righteous cause triumphs. You have probably heard of the progress of our legion, which distinguished itself everywhere. Before leaving Marseille, we had many fights in Lille, Avignon, Lambesc, Salou, Orgon and Septem, which is the last city before reaching Marseille. The legion attacked Marseille without being ordered to do so. Dopé was commanding us. The army came forward to help and our artillery began to fire. Despite being outnumbered by the enemy, we took 3 strongholds, one after another, one on the mountain. This victory and the capture of their cannon took them by surprise. During the action, Marseille was occupied by the aristocrats, who bombarded the patriotic area of the city for 24 hours. But having heard of the defeat of their whole army, they fled either by sea or towards Toulon. The next day, we entered Marseille and were welcomed by shouts of "Long live the Republic! Hurrah to the Allobroge!" Having entered Marseille long before the army, I cannot describe the joy of the people. All embraced me and, due to my role, said, "Here are the liberators." After having stayed for a while to revive their courage, we took the road for Toulon. But what a surprise to hear that the perfidious inhabitants of Toulon had opened their doors to the English and the Spanish. This did not discourage us. We strode towards Toulon. I was in the vanguard with 300 men. We arrived at Ollioules, a little town about a mile from Toulon. As soon as we arrived, the municipality organized our accommodation and ordered its citizens, I say citizens, I mean traitors, to let us drink as much as we wanted to. Why did they do that? To slit our throats during the night. But we did not fall into the trap. The commander of the column wanted us to stay in the city, but our captain, who commanded the Allobroge, told the commander that we were in front of the enemy and we should not stay here. From there, he brought us further, and the volunteers of the Basse-Alpes, who formed the vanguard with us, stayed at the gates of the city. What had the municipality done during that time? It had ordered the English to fight us, which happened at 4. There were many soldiers in the city, and the English fell on us, as did the people, who fired at us from their windows. We were forced to retreat. We lost 2 cannon and 6 of our men were killed. 18 English were killed and a captain. We came back to the army, expressing our indignation at this rebellious city. The next day, we advanced with a more imposing force, and despite enemy fire, we took the dangerous narrow pass of Ollioules, occupied by the English and the Spanish. We chased them up to the gates of Toulon. Ollioules was sacked and 8 houses burned. The enemy lost many men and 4 carts of the injured that were trying to reach Toulon. We captured 6 Spanish soldiers and a captain. We are currently in front of Toulon. The cannon have not stopped firing on the 18th and 19th of this month. Toulon is one of the most fortified cities, and I think many men will lose their lives. We are probably going to be there all winter. The general promised us that the Legion would go back to our department after the Peace of Toulon. But when will that peace happen? Fortified places are impossible to capture, and they fire at us from all sides. I ask you, my dear parents, to tell me what happened in Savoy. And we will see each other again soon? My brothers and sisters are well, and they send their regards to you and to all the family. I hope you will send news soon. I learned that my brother was in Nantes. Why did you not send me his address?
It was also during this siege that the French Republican Army held in its ranks a talented and ambitious artillery captain named Napoleon Bonaparte. Well connected to prominent political figures, Bonaparte had a clear idea of how to capture the city. He tried to present his plan to General Carteau, but was dismissed. The young Corsican officer did not give up and used his connections to be appointed artillery commander of the Republican forces. Following this promotion, he ordered different batteries to bombard the Malbousquet fort, a major obstacle to the capture of the city. Carteau was replaced as commander of the siege by General Dugommier on November 11, 1793. Dugommier, a professional soldier, immediately recognized the value of Bonaparte's plan and issued orders for it to be followed. The systematic bombardment of strategic positions forced the British to attempt a sortie on the 23rd of November. A French counterattack prevented the British from succeeding and led to the capture of British General O'Hara. Napoleon, who took part in the counterattack, wrote a letter to Henri Victor Dupin to tell him about the incident.
On the 10th, at 5 in the morning, the enemy sent 6,000 men, commanded by the English General O'Hara, governor of Toulon, and pushed aside our forward posts before reaching the battery. They neutralized 6 cannons out of 24. At this moment, our forces arrived. General Dugommier fought with the courage of a true Republican. We took the battery and captured the English general, who suffered an arm wound. We pursued the enemy with our bayonets in their backs. We killed 4,000 to 5,000 men and captured a great number of them, including a Spanish colonel, an English major, and a great number of officers of lower rank. The cannon of the convention were repaired, soon enough to increase the confusion of their retreat. Our soldiers, carried away by feelings of indignation, went immediately to Malbousquet. We chased them from the heights. We destroyed a fort that they had started building. We took a great number of tents. We destroyed what we could not carry away.
On December 16th and 17th, the final assault began. An anonymous French count fighting for the Royalists inside the city of Toulon with the British described the chaos of the attack.
Anyway, I was at a forward redoubt on the west side the same night our fate was decided on the other side. A bit before the day, we were ordered to leave our post and retreat to the city. Once we arrived, I heard of this disastrous project to order a general evacuation. My despair was easy to understand. I ran to gather my friends, who forced me to replace my uniform with a costume of pillage and disorder. This happy precaution saved my life. The enemies within were starting to shake the city and threatened to cut off our retreat. We hurried to gather our most precious belongings and went to the port. There, I witnessed the worst spectacle that the earth might have endured. A fire had destroyed all the ships, the stores, and the arsenals. The explosion was so loud that nature itself seemed disturbed. It was impossible to distinguish the sky or the earth, and the sea was only a field of fire. This was a picture of hell. It was hard to distinguish objects and distances, and the heat of the atmosphere was hard to endure, but this was little compared to what I still have to write. The Republicans had already captured most of the right side of the city. The fire was, for them, a target, and they rained down bombs and grenades on us. The Allies on the left side, warned that the insurrection was spreading behind them, fired at the city to hold back the malcontents and to protect the boarding. But there was a revolt in the arsenal and in the city. Everybody fired at everybody. Disorder was everywhere in the port, and fear forced people to retreat to that place. We could see from all sides furniture piled on the embankment, groups of men and women running and hitting each other. Shouts filled the air and screams were making this horrible spectacle more atrocious. This was the awful scene when I arrived near the dock, carrying a child in my arms and dragging several lost women. I jumped into a departing ship. As soon as we had moved, I felt something impossible to describe. Suddenly, I was violently thrown on my seat. It felt like struggling in a fire. I learned that it was the explosion of a ship which killed many people and probably my friends too. I have been unable to find them.
The end of the Siege of Toulon was followed by the bloody suppression of supposedly royalist elements. Hundreds of people were shot in the city center, and many trials were held during the following months. Napoleon Bonaparte had been wounded in the thigh by a British sergeant during the final assault, and was not involved in the suppression. Days after the end of the siege, he was promoted to the rank of Brigadier General and was sent to the Army of Italy. This episode was not of major importance to the Revolutionary Wars, but it became significant for Bonaparte's career. Toulon offered him an opportunity to prove both his valor and his leadership, and opened the doors to a senior position in the army. Had the British sergeant killed Bonaparte instead of wounding him during the final assault, history would have been very different. However, greater things were to come for Napoleon Bonaparte.